everyone. Episode 38 of the Potomac RPG Podcast. People who deny the existence of dragons are often eaten by dragons.
Welcome one and all to the Potomac RPG Podcast, your source for old news, tired conversation, and mediocre advice for all of your favorite tabletop role-playing games. I'm your host and tattooed refugee from an extra-dimensional labyrinth, Adam.
I'm your true name finder, Matt.
And I'm your peasant turned slave on an alien world, then turned master magician, Steve.
Nice. Thanks for being on, guys. We're recovering after last night's session. Tom taking his seat in the DM's chair for this week. Steve, how was it to have a week off finally?
That was nice. The part of my life that isn't D&D was eating into a lot of my time, so it was nice to be able to just sort of sit back and roll some dice and actually pull out my beautiful death saves death dice that I never had to roll, but I thought I was going to get close because, my gosh, it's pretty squishy at first level.
Yeah, absolutely. But it was fun. I mean, a heck of a lot of battles for a first session. So really interesting job by Tom there. Like at first I thought it'd be just, one little battle just to kind of spice things up. No, it was like one after the other there. So
yeah,
it was
throw us right into it.
Yeah.
It's kind of an in media res, like, aside from the little bit of preamble of, you're wandering up the road just to help us sort of orient ourselves into the characters. You could almost see if we knew those characters well, like could just start the scenario like you are at the gates, the bell's ringing, and what do you do? That was kind of a cool way to mix things up.
Yeah, and once again, Ben almost died. If I was him, I don't think I'd ever buy a miniature again. He's always on the edge of death with every single character he makes. I don't understand it. Now, granted, he was protecting me.
Now, so.
Yeah, he was protecting me from.
I think he does have the highest death count, though. I think of all the players.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can see if you look at his character sheet, he's got a higher Constitution score than Strength on his Paladin. That tells you all you need to know. Right? He's a Strength-based Paladin, so I think he realized he's putting 2 to 2 together. Level 4 taking that tough feat, get an extra hit point per level or something. I can see that happening.
Absolutely. Well, hey, let's get into the topic for today. Players of tabletop role-playing come from all walks of life and backgrounds. Some found their way here because of video games they've played. Others maybe saw shows like Game of Thrones or Stranger Things. But I'm willing to bet a huge chunk of our player base got here because of all the fantasy novels we read growing up. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, fantasy literature. Now, Matt, I know you've got a good long list of books you've read over the years. How have fantasy novels impacted your love of tabletop role-playing?
Well, I would say that the two have sort of evolved kind of simultaneously. It wasn't really, it hasn't really been causative. I know, like when I was a kid. So the first fantasy novel that I ever read was probably I was in 4th grade, and it was A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula.
Oh yeah, classic.
And I'm going to actually still say that's my favorite book, ever. And it's not really, and it's not really an RPG-ish world at all for those of you who are familiar with it. But it was kind of a new thing for me. It kind of set up, it was sort of this, it kind of opened doors in my mind, is how I would describe it. And I didn't really get into RPGs until a few years later, until I guess I was like 11 or 12 or something like that. And at that time, I had started reading other books, and I had started reading Dragonlance novels and things like that. But weirdly enough, I had only played Dungeons and Dragons a little bit, and actually the game I played the most of when I was that age was actually Robotech, of all things, with the not so great Palladium system.
So when you found Wizards of Earthsea, so my first fantasy novel I picked up was the first book of the Lord of the Rings, which is, I know, Adam's favorite series.
My favorite, absolutely.
And I did this to myself in I was in grade 3 or 4 problems in that, but it was one of those did you guys have those Scholastic book fairs growing up, or maybe this is just a Canadian thing where so you guys had this
Americans used to read.
Yeah, fair enough. I just maybe the name wouldn't have been the same or something, but that was I saw that, and it was like the first printing of an edition where they were the books were like mostly white, but they had these like bands of gold with this like elvish script on it and a very evocative sort of cover page. Yeah. And of course, that just drew my attention in, right? And so that I was just wondering, Matt, like, how did you come across Wizard of Earthsea? Did someone recommend it to you? Library?
It was in school. No, it was in school. I'm trying to remember. So Lord of the Rings, I probably read like a year, like something. I'm trying to remember, or The Hobbit, I probably read first. But it was around the same time, but I think after. But Wizard of Earthsea, I remember I was in 4th grade, Mrs. Nelson's class, and it was the classes at that time, elementary schools at least. They had like in the back, like there was like I remember there being like book like little racks of books for like, because they wanted the kids to just like read stuff. Like that was the thing. And I remember like that one was there. It's like, this looked interesting. And I remember it was a very like worn I remember the copy was kind of worn. And I remember I don't remember if I had to sign it out. I don't remember what the procedure was as in 4th grade. But I remember reading it, and it was just like wow, like I mean, and it was accessible. Like that was the thing. It wasn't. And it's really, Ursula K. Le Guin's talents, as a writer is that, she could write some fairly deep subject matter in simple language. As a 4th grader, I mean, maybe a slightly precocious 4th grader, but as a 4th grader, like I was, I didn't have any trouble with, the novel at all. Yeah. And it still holds up. I've gone back and reread it in my adult life. And it was just one of those things that said, yeah, like, books aren't just a, C-spot run or my my adventures on vacation with my parents. Like it could be something, like, because that's the thing. I mean, like, when kids, and they teach kids to read, the stuff they teach them is that, things they want to be like good and wholesome and crap like that. Yeah. But that's not interesting, and no, so it's when suddenly now there's something different. And you read it and you kind of realize, the power, the power of books, right? I mean, that's what it was for me. It was really the power of books. Like, yeah, it opens up these vistas.
But like, what about that? Like, how did that book grab you? Because I can remember very specifically, like the cover of that Lord of the Rings book, like it's still burned into my brain. And that's what grabbed me.
The cover of that one is from a scene midway through the book, which I didn't realize at the time. It's a pretty cool scene. It's Sparrowhawk, his main character, standing on this cliff holding a staff glowing while this like flying creature is like trying to attack him or something. And it's a scene from the midpoint of the book. And I remember, it was very striking. I mean, the cover obviously helped. But what hooked me was just sort of the opening of it, because so Ursula K. Le Guin is very good at writing about, she would write people, others. It was, non-white, gender stuff, whatever. If you've ever read her stuff, she was like one of the first people to do that before it was politically correct. But the thing that made Sparrowhawk kind of almost, not maybe universally appealing, but very broadly appealing, was that he was, I mean, not to, boast or anything, but I was something of a, precocious child, and very overconfident in my innate abilities. And Sparrowhawk is the same way. Like, that's his character. He's, as a child, he has this talent, and he's very full of himself. And and he pays a price for it. Yeah. And so the character hooked me, because it was such like, yeah, here someone's talent is like racing ahead of his peers, and suddenly, he gets in a lot of trouble because of it. And so the character had for a boy of, of my, kind of place in the world, like it had that hook, and so it sort of combined this, this moral lesson with the heroic journey, and it just spoke to me in a
That's
way.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So Adam, you heard both of our first books, but what about you?
Well, I mean, I, like most things in my life, I backed into it. I would love to say, oh, I started with Tolkien or Ursula K. Le Guin or something like that. Now, what actually happened was back in grade school, you remember the book Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim?
Oh,
Okay.
I saw the cartoon.
Yeah, so I had just finished reading that. I don't know how old I was. I was pretty young, and then I noticed in the bookstore a series called the Redwall. I don't know if you've heard of that, but basically it's animals set in this like European feudal fantasy type realm. So the Redwall series was kind of my start. Not the best start to getting into fantasy, but hey, I was a kid. It was cool. The little
And you
animals.
didn't end up a
who are-
furry, so I mean, not to say anything wrong with being a furry. I mean,
very
that's,
very close
you know,
there, huh?
well, you know, it's
but
we got to be inclusive, you know. So
yeah,
I got to open my
well,
mind.
and the thing was like around not too far different from that time. I remember reading The Hobbit, and it was probably in school, and I equated The Hobbit with like old poems and stuff like that old style of writing that I just couldn't get into, and that probably colored it for years because I didn't get through the entire Fellowship of the Ring and all that until much later in my life. I just could not grok it in a sense early on. So yeah, I don't have the best start, but I think I've hit a lot of the classics. I got into it. I mean, in my teen years, that's when I started getting into R.A. Salvatore, and that's where D&D and stuff really kind of came forefront. Because I mean, I don't know who hasn't read the Drist's series of books that are up to like dozens now.
There's a
Can I
lot.
tell you something? Can I tell you
Yeah.
something? I've
Yeah.
never read a Drist novel. I've read
Really?
some Forgotten Realms novels, but I've never
I read one.
You're kidding. Oh, that series at that age was really what kind of got me into D&D specifically. But I will say, one of the nice things is after reading that, you start to hone your tastes over the years, because looking back at those novels, they were great, but they were great for a 15-year-old.
Yeah, and the thing is I think they became sort of too popular because like suddenly everybody was playing a dual wielding dark elf.
That was definitely a thing for a while in D&D.
It was a thing, absolutely. But yeah. I mean, it's really neat to hear everyone's kind of start in fantasy
It's
novels.
come from all kinds of different novels, different places. Like I would love to have the whole rest of the crew and just sort of ping all of them for where they started. Because I think I'd be interested to hear where someone like Tom, obviously being a bit younger than the three of us, what really grabbed him. And Sarah, I would love to hear her talk about it, because I know it's going to be a little different than the rest of us as well. So
absolutely. Well, Steve, I mean, you said Lord of the Rings was kind of your entry point. Where did you end up going from there to keep it going?
Oh my goodness. I think from Lord of the Rings, I think the next one that I read was, so I read Magician Apprentice and Magician Master by Raymond E. Feist, and I read them backwards. I was young enough to get confused somehow when I was trying to buy the book. I just saw them on like the shelf. I was like a Costco with my grandma, my Oma. I should be more appropriate. She'd be upset if she heard me call her grandma. And I'm sure, she's an avid listener to the podcast at,
absolutely
82 years old.
What's up, Oma?
Peace. So that was sort of where I went next from there. I kind of went through the Rift War saga of books. I think that was kind of like my next thing point. I did have this ill-fated flirtation with trying to read the Silmarillion. I can't probably not even pronounce it right. I bought it. I tried. I really did. I mean, I tried it a few times. Even now,
I got through it.
Go back.
I got through it.
Well, I mean, some of us enjoy punishment more than others. No, but it just, for whatever reason, it was just too dense and a little dry. I actually read The Hobbit after Lord of the Rings, which is, I know a lot of people start off with how that's sort of like the entry point to Tolkien.
Hobbit's an easier read.
It absolutely was. So I think that, going from Lord of the Rings and then you go to Hobbit and then the Silmarillion, it's just like, what is going on here? Pick a style. Let's go. But yeah, that was sort of for me where I jumped off into something else.
Oh, I about the same time I read Magician Apprentice and Magician Master. I can still picture in my head that scene in the Colosseum, and if you know what I'm talking about, exactly what that picture is, and that was my first experience with like big magic, like big, like huge things happening, and
that's why I still love. I mean, like my favorite go-to for playing a character in like a game like D&D, and that is I always want to play a wizard. That's what I always want to play. that I don't because I know I fall into like very familiar, like I already know what the character is going to be like before I even start playing them because they all seem to be the same, and it's kind of annoying. And it's like I want to push myself and try different things and different concepts, so I have to not. But that's like my go-to desire is to like play a wizard because it's just baked in my brain. Like that's fantasy for me. That's fantasy at its core. I mean, we're going to talk a little more about some other series later, so I don't want to start busting out all kinds of references, but there's another series we're going to go into. My favorite character there is a wizard. I mean, a lot of people probably like the character, but it's the wizard again. It just happens time and time
what
again.
book could you be talking about? There's only like one or two of them that have wizards
exactly
in them, right?
Well, yeah, but it's just that trope is just so
powerful,
endemic to fantasy to me. Like I almost find like going back and looking at like Gandalf and I'm like, he doesn't really do anything.
That's the funny
like
thing.
weird.
That's the funny thing. It's right. The magic that Gandalf uses is like really subtle. I mean, presumably he breaks out a lot of shit in the fight with the Balrog, but like you don't ever know, right? It's like kind of an off-panel thing. And here is this epic battle, and we're gonna just tell you a little bit about it.
I mean, we're not gonna go deep down into Lord of the Rings here, but I think there's probably something to be said, and people who have said it much, much better and more in depth than I could be bothered to do. But magic and like the rings of power and all that, there's like there's something, it's magic, but it's not magic in the way we've come to expect it, where like I open a book and cast a spell. It's like the sort of ability to like almost enforce your will sort of becomes manifest in the world. And I think it's really like a pre-fantasy idea of what magic could be like, because I think the tropes weren't really, I don't know for sure. I'm not a historian of
well, you had
literature,
pulp fantasy. You had pulp fantasy before that, so like
right.
Conan and like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, still like there's not like the today we're like, oh yeah, you got a pointy hat with stars on it, a staff, a familiar, and a spell book, and you're like hibbity bobbity boo, and I cast fireball. That didn't really exist then. So it was just, but like there's just this ability to sort of enforce your will, kind of point where like, I don't know, it's interesting stuff. But then we don't know how did Saruman just suddenly make his Uruk-hai, or as the movie likes to call them specifically, their fighting Uruk-hai, which makes me wonder, are there farmer Uruk-hai? This is my barrister Uruk-hai. Very legalistic. Like, I don't know. That's some expanded universe shit that we should get into. But I digress.
Conquer Middle Earth with an army of lawyers.
Yeah, there you go. Well, hey, let's get into some questions for the week here. Our first post comes from Reddit user Jimmy King Live, who asks, looking for novel suggestions. I've been playing 5e for a little over 3 years, and I would like to expand my knowledge. What D&D novels should I start with? So, Steve, when it comes to fantasy novels that give you that D&D feel specifically, would you have any recommendations for Jimmy King Live?
Okay, so here's where I said before we're going to go into other things and I don't want to talk about it. This is where I talk about it. For me, the quintessential, I'm going to read some D&D in novel form, and it's going to be like in reading that I enjoy, despite the fact that it's got problematic elements from a modern perspective, is the original Dragonlance trilogy.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's just like down to like party composition, down to, they're going to new locations. I mean, it's literally, it's a campaign, right?
It came from a game. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of where I was going. Like it has all these elements that feel like you're reading a D&D experience, because it literally was their D&D game. And then they turned it into novels and into modules under the Dragonlance banner. And so you've got like, Cameron's the wizard or the warrior, and then his brother Raceland's the wizard, and you have Tanis, he's the ranger, and then what's his name, Tasselhoff, the Kender, who's the rogue, and then you've got like some recurring villain NPCs. You've got you got the cleric in the group with Gold Moon. Like it's a D&D party. They're going on a D&D adventure, and there's just nothing better than, I haven't read it a number of years. I've thought about going back and just sort of picking it up as an easy read. I don't know how well it holds up reading it as, someone of my age now versus when I read it the first time around, but the, fond memory. So that when I think of a knight in shining armor, Stern Brightblade comes right to mind. Like that's easy, and so that to me is like, that's the go-to. That's where I would go. I never really got too much into the Forgotten Realms novels. I did what was it, the Time of Troubles or whatever, where with like Cyric and
right, when the gods get cast down.
Yeah. And that's where, what's his name, Kalimvor, and there's a third character, the female character, whose name's escaping me right now. Midnight, thank you. And you know, I read that series, but it's still just never kind of grabbed me.
It was okay. It wasn't great. It was. The
other one had dragons in it. I mean, there's dragons. I mean, dragons are just cool. You know, like all of Lord of the Rings, I got one dragon. Here they're like, you want a dragon? How about dragons? And they're like different colors. And snap! Like, and then there's dudes running around who are like dragon men. Like the artwork in the first Dragonlance book.
Oh, the art's fantastic.
But what's always stuck with me for some reason, the chapter intros always had a little bit of black and white artwork to accompany them. So you'd open it up and like chapter 1's got this chapter, and there's one where it's the first time you see a Draconian, and the way it's drawn, and it's still like burned into my brain to this day. That's what a Draconian looks like. That's probably what I would want. Like if I played a Dragonborn PC, that's the sort of style I would imagine them in. And it's just like baked into my brain. So that there for me, that's got to be like, if you haven't read Dragonlance, go there. And if you like it, there's a heck of a lot more reading that can come from there. Like a lot. And not all of it's great, right? But even the stuff that's kind of decent, you know, it's still pretty good reading, you know, as long as that's the trope in a world that you enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, I'll kind of jump in here and say that, absolutely the core, what I call the core novels of Dragonlance, which is Chronicles and Legends. But I actually didn't start with those in Dragonlance. The one I started with, and I was in a small bookstore with my mother, and the cover art jumped out at me. And it's very famous cover art. It's the one I'm sure you may have seen it. It's the one with the two dragons in battle, and one of them like spear the other, and there's like fire shooting out of its neck. It's a very famous picture. That book is The Legend of Huma by Richard A. Knack, which takes place thousands of years before the Dragonlance Chronicles stories, but it's actually a great jumping off point into the world, because Huma's like Odysseus, in the Odyssey. He's like this mythical figure that kind of casts a shadow over the future. And so that story was the one I read first. It was the first one I read in Dragonlance, and it was a really good pick because suddenly Sturm's character, because Sturm idolizes Huma, it made total sense, and it kind of had this incredible context for the series, even though it was written after. But it takes place before, and it's a really good read. But I wouldn't just restrict. Dragonlance is the most, I think, novellic of the settings. But I would say the Prism Pentad, which is the main series for Dark Sun, if you can find it, is pretty good. It's pretty good. I mean, the Forgotten Realms books, I read the Time Trial. I never got into the Forgotten Realms books as much. But definitely Dragonlance was awesome, and the Prism Pentad for Dark Sun was actually pretty cool also.
Well, I'll put a note in there for Forgotten Realms, because I was not in on the Dragonlance as much as I was Forgotten Realms. And really for the question answer, I think a lot of it depends on your age as well. So they've been playing for a little over 3 years. So again, like we mentioned before, if you're young, I think the Dark Elf trilogy still holds today for a younger type reader because of the excitement that's involved in the fight scenes and stuff like that, and introduction to the drow and all that.
Salvador is very good at action sequences.
Action, exactly. Yeah. He's very good at that. I think if you're an older player who, I think reading those books, I don't think it's going to grab you the same way. Some of the newer authors, I think maybe do a bit better job. One that comes to mind is probably like Joe Abercrombie with the Blade Itself series. Kind of still that little bit of party base in there, I think is a really good kind of gritty novel to get into fantasy wise, or go back to the classics like what Matt mentioned with Wizard of Earthsea. I know it's not D&D, but it certainly gives you all those feelings. The Feist series, you got Betrayal, Krondor, the Betrayal, stuff like that, I think are good starting places for kind of getting that D&D feel out of novels. I don't know if you guys agree with that or not, but I mean, Dragonlance is certainly a place to go. I just don't have as much experience as you guys on that. What do you guys think about those classics, though? Like, should you start with Tolkien?
I was just going to say, we're talking about like what's good reading to get that D&D feel, and we didn't even mention Tolkien, which is kind of the whole basis of the archetypes that are, especially in Forgotten Realms, are pretty prevalent. Yeah. So, I mean, definitely that feels like good reading. A lot of people watch the movies now. They're more accessible than the books. The books are a bit dense. It depends on what sort of,
but the books have the
time
maps.
effort you want to put in.
The books have the maps.
Books have the maps.
That's true. And
that's why
definitely helpful. I mean, they're good. I mean, they're missing some of the tropes that, have really sort of gotten into the more modern versions of fantasy storytelling that, even stretching back to like,
but actually
it's tough.
Yeah, but I'm going to actually make now sort of a weird kind of, this is like kind of a weird recommendation. I would say it might be worth looking, at, and there's a whole string of them from, the original ones to the newer ones, is Conan. I mean, it's pulp fantasy. It's a little different, but it sets up sort of, kind of a lot, at least some of the same ideas, with magic basically being kind of not something that good people use, but it's sort of the proto, like if you look at the evolution of fantasy, right? Really the pulp, you have myths and legends, and then you have, and you have, in medieval times, you have, ballads and things like that, which had elements of the fantastic. And then as we got into the, early 20th century, you have, really pulp short stories. You have Conan and Cole, and that type of thing. And then, Lord of the Rings kind of rises as sort of the next generation, really the first. It's kind of the trendsetter, but if you look at that evolution, you kind of go from the pulp to Lord of the Rings, and then you get to modern fantasy. So I think it really just depends where you want to, kind of where in the evolution of fantasy you want to jump in and have your first kind of immersion.
Yeah, agreed. Well, hopefully Jim and King Live, that gives you some ideas of where to start with. All of them, I think, are absolutely valid and good ones to go with. And good luck on your reading journey that's soon to come.
I have news here.
And the sound of Ralphie the News Goblin can mean only one thing. It's time for Potomac RPG News.
Ralphie!
So we have some exciting news coming out from Connor Trinske over at ScreenRant.com with an article titled Dungeons & Dragons Retail Listings Hint at a New Book Reveal Next Week. And it looks like the setting might just be Dragonlance. Now, we just talked a bunch about Dragonlance. Matt, what do you think of a Dragonlance adventure coming out? And also, looking back at the last 40 years of Dragonlance novels that have come out, we talked a little bit about what, your favorite books, and you mentioned the first one you read, but what's your favorite Dragonlance book to get you in the mood for a Dragonlance D&D game?
So as I said earlier, I think Legend of Huma, I mean, everyone jumps to the Chronicles, but I think Legend of Huma really is the kind of gives you an idea what the whole setting is about. But and while I do love the idea of a Dragonlance game, there's always been, Dragonlance has always had this weird problem. It's the opposite. It's the opposite of the Forgotten Realms problem, which is that the Dragonlance problem is because there's such established story and canon, you're afraid of an adventure messing up the established world. Forgotten Realms is the other problem. It's like, well, it's all this adventuring, so they don't want to write any novels that like lock things down. And so it really requires a good creative director. But I know when I was in high school, we always dreams like, this is going to be a Dragonlance movie. There's going to be all these we had all these kind of teenage hopes that never occurred. So anything that kind of increases the popularity of Dragonlance, I think is a good thing. And an adventure, adventure is fine. And I think nowadays with kind of modern business, they have creative directors. So I think they're better at sort of not messing with canon too much, or in a way that makes sense for the adventure. So it could be great. They're going to need rules for magic users because you have the Moons of Magic and all that stuff. So setting specifically.
Well, so here's the thing, right? How do you do the Moons of Magic in a game where you've heavily de-emphasized alignment? Because the moons were all about alignment, good, neutral, and evil.
Yes.
It's so I know there's a lot of like, there was a lawsuit that then, got dismissed without prejudice, and the authors of the original Dragonlance novels were writing some new stuff for Wizards, and now there's like, oh, wait for more cool news to come. So they're definitely, you can see why the table might be set, and someone could say, oh, look, we think there's a new book coming out, and boom, it's going to be Dragonlance stuff. Certainly you can see the table being set. And I think that, as I'm thinking it through and listening to what you said, Matt, I almost think that if there was going to be a Dragonlance book, this might actually be the type, because, if I'm remembering correctly, like this time is usually when they announce the like book of like some adventures, not a giant single campaign that goes through an entire book, but like Ghost of Saltmarsh last year, where they went to the Greyhawk setting, and they kind of, just touched on
like
it. Really, exactly. And so I think that would make a lot of sense if they were going to do a book set in the Dragonlance setting, because they don't have to deal necessarily with some of these larger issues, because there's not an expectation that they're giving you a very detailed setting and subclasses or things like that. They'll, they find some interesting rules bit to throw in there, and then sort of Leah, that maybe you can give us like, I don't know, dragon ratting or something. That'd be cool. That would be cool. Can't go thinking back to my second edition Council of Worms box set there, where you had your dragon and your dragon companion. But will they do a Dragonlance book? I mean, that would be cool. But I almost like, I feel like it makes sense in terms of like the practicality of it, that they would do it like as an adventure book. But how unsatisfying is that going to be if they drop a book that's Dragonlance and it's just, and it's just, I mean, it's like if they dropped a book of planar adventures and called that Planescape. Like I would be, that's my baby, right? And I would just be furious. No, not really any great novels set there, unfortunately. I tried to read them. I did read them. Just
I read one. I read one.
They just weren't. They weren't great. It's hard to write for. But in any event, I would love to see Dragonlance. I mean, there's one thing that, like, the one trope that never really gets a lot of play in D&D, despite the fact that like it seems such an intrinsic part of fantasy, is that Sturm Brightblade type character, like the knightly orders and things like that, all the chivalry and all that. None of that really gets. I mean, you got like the Knight of the Crown or whatever, Oath of the Crown, and Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, which is Garbo. Other than that, there's not really much that even touches on it, despite the fact that you're playing in the Forgotten Realms, which has all kinds of knightly orders. I should know. I'm running a game about one. And so that whole piece is kind of missing. So it'd be great to see that come in a D&D book. Same idea with the Orders of Magic. I mean, they had the Towers of High Sorcery, and like magic wasn't just, oh, my character's a random person who happens to know how to cast magical spells. It was like, you went off and you got like some sort of training, and there was like ranks of wizardry and the higher. Exactly. Like all that stuff made it cool to be like, sometimes it's just like, oh yeah, I'm a same normal guy just like you. I just have access to the infinite powers of the arcane. Okay, cool. Like that seems.
I think for Dragonlance that's true, because Dragonlance especially, like, there's so much setting stuff and so much, there's so much of like an established society and culture that it's not just, oh, my character's this class. It's like, okay, how do you fit in?
Exactly. And that to me, like, as I sit back and I thought about when I was preparing for you guys to start getting subclasses in Avernus, like that was part of the feel there. Like these things seem to, they should mean something in terms of like the setting and established society. Like you just don't have people randomly deciding they just figure it on their own. Everyone just become an artillerist and start blowing things up. Like there should be some kind of like structure and meaning and place in society where like people who blow things up get together and figure out how to blow things up better together. And when I'm inventing, I'm sitting here and I'm always gestating on like this sort of prophesied one day I'll run a homebrew campaign setting where like the classes would have those types of opportunities to really like be sort of hooked into the world more than just, well, this guy is a guy with a sword who has second wind, and this guy's a guy with a smaller sword that does sneak attack damage. Maybe there's more to it than that. And I think what would be cool, I don't expect it, but what would be cool is if a Dragonlance type book were to come out and it were to have systems for those types of, you want to call them like as a general system, like guilds or orders or organizations, whatever, but to like set up those sort of, examples of organizations where like the class and the world kind of come together in their story that's informed, kind of like how in the Magic the Gathering setting books that they put out, each of them's kind of tried to introduce like a new thing. Like a Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica gave us guilds, and it was not bad. Then when they went with Mystic Odysseys of Theros, there's a whole subsystem in there for making it so that being sort of aligned towards and working towards the favor of a particular god, regardless of whether you're a cleric, can have an impact on the game, and it can actually be a sort of a tiered sort of growth for a character. So the more that they do, the more sort of boons that they get, which is a little bit of a power creep, but you can kind of manage it because it's a DM giving rewards, and sort of maybe introducing something like that where it's like I can like put my character into like a knightly order, and there's some sort of benefits to accruing rank and title in that order would make perfect sense, obviously, in a world like Dragonlance, and would be great to port over into home games and that. So that'd be another cool thing to see. I don't know that we will, but I can hope.
Yeah. Well, it should be interesting. If you're listening to this on release, they're going to announce what the book is tomorrow. That's January 12th. And then the release of the actual book is going to be March 16th. So I'll have the link in the show notes if you're interested. Check it out, and we'll see how a Dragonlance adventure plays out in the world of D&D. But for right now, we're going to take a step out for a moment. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after the break. When we were first getting this podcast together, we knew we needed some good music. And we looked into a lot of options that are out there, but we settled on Soundstripe. At soundstripe.com, they have such a wide variety of high-quality music to choose from. Every song that you hear on this podcast is from Soundstripe, and we couldn't be happier with what they have to offer. And it's not just music. They have a ton of sound effects and video stock footage as well. So if you're making a podcast or videos on YouTube or have some creative project you're working on, check out Soundstripe. They're worth a look. And right now you can use the promo code Potomac RPG, all one word, and get 10% off. That's Potomac RPG, all one word, to get 10% off your purchase. Elevate your work with the finest stock media all in one place at soundstripe.com. And with that, let's get back to the show. How about another question? This post comes from Reddit user Safia, who asks, what fantasy books do you consider easy to read? I'm currently struggling to find myself invested enough in new books to continue reading past the first few chapters, so I'm looking for recommendations for fantasy books that are easy to read from the beginning. When I say easy to read, I mean easy to fall into. You pick it up and there's very little barrier for entry. The story catches you without being off-puttingly immediate. The writing grabs your attention and doesn't let go. You never get to chapter 2 or 3 and wonder if maybe you should go do some laundry instead of continuing. The ones that spring to my mind as examples all have a young adult feel to them. Arcane Ascension or the Rain Wild Chronicles. Are there many adult fiction books that you found grab you immediately that you can't put down, or is this mostly a trait of YA style stories? So, Steve, some fantasy novels do have a habit of being a bit of a slog at first before you can get into it. Any suggestions for a book that grabbed you right away to help Sophia out?
So this might not surprise you guys all that much because I've talked about it fairly recently, but I picked up the first book, Glenn Cook's Black Company. And I basically didn't stop. I basically didn't stop reading until I was done the whole series. I started it at the very end of August. I mean, I'm a pretty busy guy, and I read a lot for my job, right? So it takes a lot for me to get into a book, and I haven't read much since I finished the series. It's sort of how I get like hooked, and then I'll read, and then I'm done, and then I'm not reading again because I'm busy with other stuff. I read through the entire series from the very last week in August. I think I finished up by like the second week in October, I would get every morning, I would carve out time to go sit out on the patio with my Kindle, and I would read before doing anything else. Last thing I did every day was read. If I could get out and I just needed to take a break from work, I was picking up a book and reading, because, you know, I'm at home, so easy to do during COVID. And that grabbed me. It's very much written for an adult rather than a child. So it's not this young A stuff. And it treats you like you're an intelligent reader insofar as it doesn't explain everything and guide you by the hand, and you have to infer things, and you can go back and reread if you want to catch more nuance. Everyone tells me that like a second and third read gives you so much more context.
Unreliable narrator.
Exactly. That's the other big point, right? Yeah, is the unreliable and at times multiple narrators. You're kind of going back and forth, and I found that just grabbed me, and I couldn't wait to, you know, continue reading and see what would happen next. So that would be, for anybody asking me for the foreseeable future, anyways, that's going to be my go-to answer, is just pick up Glenn Cook's Black Company and talk to me in a month or two.
Yeah, I'm going to second that, because the Black Company was the first time I experienced the gray area. And what I mean by that is, whenever I was reading things like Magician Apprentice and some of the Forgotten Realms books, it was very good versus evil, very black and white. And the Black Company was my first time looking at the protagonist as maybe not that great of a person. The people around, they
very
had
relative.
shades of good and bad. And I like that it wasn't prefaced by this huge explanation of the world that you were in and the rules of it and all this stuff. It was almost a bit of dropping you in media res at the beginning, and you just kind of pick things up as it goes along. It's very kind of fluid, and you learn as you go, but very easy to fall into. Probably, if not my favorite, definitely, you know, top 5 fantasy series of all time. So I'm going to second on that. Matt, how about you?
Okay, well, of course I'm going to third Black Company. I love Black Company.
There you go.
But I'm going to say something. But first, the thing, one of the things that makes Black Company just an easy read is the style. For those of you listeners who aren't familiar with it, it's written in the style of war fiction. Like this is like the account of a soldier in Vietnam, except it's a fantasy world. So, you know, magic's a weapon of mass destruction, and, you know, the soldiers do all kinds of horrible things, and it's a first person. It's written in a first person perspective, which is really very different from a lot of novels. Now, for something that's easy to read, but it's still quite adult, I'm actually going to kind of maybe bend the rules a little bit, and I'm going to say not a book, but a comic. And I am going to actually recommend the Artesia comics, Mark Smiley, I think. I don't know if it's the artist or the writer or both. And there's a book. I know there's an actual book that takes place in the same world, which I haven't read. But I read through the first few volumes, I guess, of that comic, and it's really good.
Very cool.
So
good recommendation. Yeah. I mean, like it's kind of hard to pinpoint, just because there's a lot of books that kind of grab us right away. But I think the reason we all went towards Black Company as a recommendation is it is so much different than your standard high fantasy type novel, and it's really easy to fall into, and it's definitely not young adult, and it's a really good read. I highly recommend it, and thanks guys for those options for Sophia. Hope that helps you out a little bit. But we've been talking about all different fantasy books that we've read over the years, but I'm curious to see just how much you guys know when it comes to fantasy literature. So let's put you two to the test. Listeners, it's trivia time. Welcome to Trivia Time, where we pit our two guests against each other in a battle of game knowledge and history. So here's how it'll work. I have a bunch of questions here from a quiz I found over at Zimbio.com. Some of these are pretty basic, but we got to start somewhere, right? So all these questions are about popular fantasy novels. Rules are simple. First one to buzz in gets the answer. Get it right, get a point. Get it wrong, lose a point, and your opponent gets to try to steal for free. You two ready?
Sure.
All right.
Let's do it.
Let's get into it. Question number 1. Oh, God, you guys are going to get this so quick. They're so damn easy. Like, if I'm getting them right, you guys are going to get them. So here we go. J.R.R. Tolkien's One Ring was inscribed with 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and Steve.
In the darkness, bind them.
Yeah. Could you get any easier for Steve? Holy shit.
This is a click
All right,
fest.
Steve.
Okay.
you got a point. Well done on a gimme. All right. Question number 2. This George R.R. Martin series of books has been adapted into HBO's hugely popular Game of Thrones.
Can we just stop and have some real, harder questions?
Well, is anyone going to answer?
A Song of Ice and Fire?
A Song of Ice and Fire. Very good. Boy, you guys really know your stuff.
Are they all going to be like this?
Not all of them. Not all of them. Here we go. Question number 3. The lion's resurrection is a key event in C.S. Lewis's Tales of Narnia. What was the lion's name? Simba? Oh, Matt?
Aslan.
Aslan is correct. All right, 2-1.
Notice, Matt, how with the really easy question that you took, I didn't go on an extended rant about how are they all going to be this easy?
Honestly, I feel like this is just going to be a click fest.
It probably will be. Although as it goes, it gets a little bit more difficult. So question number 4. This Dragon Riders of Pern author was the first woman to win a Nebula Award and a Hugo Award for fiction. A, J.K. Rowling, B, Anne Rice, C, Laurel K. Hamilton, or D, Anne McCaffrey. Matt.
Anne McCaffrey.
Anne McCaffrey is correct. Well done. Is that a little bit more?
It's a little bit
what
hard.
You guys were looking for?
A little bit. Not really hard, but a little bit.
I've not been complaining. I mean, you bring the questions, we bring the answers.
There you go. Question number 5. Robert E. Howard's most popular books related the adventures of this thief-turned-king in the Hyborian Age. A, Matt. Conan is correct. Well done. Taking the lead 3-2. I can't believe you guys haven't gotten one wrong yet. Question number 6. This fictional land, conceived by Terry Pratchett, was carried on the backs of 4 elephants standing... Oh, geez.
Steve beat me.
Steve beat you? Okay. Steve.
Discworld?
Discworld is correct. Well done. You tie it up 3-3. What a
Never even read one of those novels.
I've read one of them. They're kind of silly.
All right. Well, let's keep going. Question number 7. A boy and his dragon must flee from an evil king in this novel whose author was just 15 when he began writing it. A, Steve?
Is it Aragon?
Aragon is correct. Well done.
I haven't read that one either.
That was a movie also.
They did. Yeah.
All right. Question number 8. Modern fantasy is often considered to have started with this Scottish author who wrote The Princess and the Goblin and fantasies in the mid-19th century. A, Oscar Wilde. B, George MacDonald. C, Mark Twain. Or D, Lewis Carroll.
Well, Matt, I mean, they're all easy questions.
So this one I'll guess. This one's actually a little hard. I'm going to guess Lewis Carroll.
Lewis Carroll is incorrect. Steve, chance to steal.
Can I get the answers again?
Sure. A, Oscar Wilde. B, George MacDonald. C, Mark Twain. Or D, Lewis Carroll.
I'm going to go with B.
George MacDonald? That is correct. Well done. You got a point. 5-2. Ooh, that
finally a real trivia question.
There you go. There you go.
And where'd you say it was written where? In Ireland, you said?
Scotland.
Yeah. And that was purely predicated on the last name and thinking about the land in which it was written. That's
a trivia question, though.
Okay, well, I'm glad we got there finally. All right, question number 9. This Philip Pullman series often feels like an atheist counterpoint to the world of Narnia. A, A Song of Ice and Fire. B, His Dark Materials. Matt.
B, His Dark Materials.
That is
which was
correct.
also a movie. It should be.
And it's a TV series on HBO.
And a series, yeah. A better question would be where the term dark materials comes from.
Okay, well, guys, I can only find so much, all right? Like, there's not a whole lot of fantasy novel quizzes out there.
Don't loop me in here and lump me in with this malcontent. who's only got 2 or 3 points out of all these real easy questions he's talking about.
All right, here we go. Last question. This contemporary writer moves fantasy elements to the modern world in books like American Gods and Neverwhere. A, Matt.
Neil Gaiman.
Neil Gaiman is correct. Well done.
It's Neil Gaiman, actually.
Unfortunately, you are
Is it
one.
Gaiman or Gaiman?
Sure, I think it's.
I don't think it
Gaiman.
really matters.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
But regardless, very close game. Steve edges you out 5-4. Well done. That was trivia time, Steve. Congratulations to you. Yay.
Thank you.
We need to do ones where there's no movies.
No movies. Okay, that'll be next time. No movies.
Matt will win if you just make the quiz exactly what he wants you to make it. He'll win every time. You can guarantee it. If only I could pick the questions.
There you go.
I'm setting a category or a limiter on the questions, not picking them.
Well, good job, guys. Thanks for playing. Let's get into our last post of the week. This comes from Reddit user Bara Bowman, who asks, has fantasy changed at all that much in the last 20 years? I grew up reading fantasy and sci-fi, almost everything I could get my hands on. I read the greats, Tolkien, Heinlein, Bradbury, etc. I was really into Dragonlance at one point. My favorite sci-fi series is Robotech. There you go, Matt. And fantasy is Lone Wolf. I sort of grew disenfranchised with fantasy in the early 2000s. It seemed to be very repetitive and the same tropes kept being repeated. Did not get what the big deal with Harry Potter was, and I've read all the books and seen all the movies. Also read Sanderson a bit. Don't see what the big deal is again. Same thing of a lot that I've been recommended. He says, kind of goes on for a bit here, but he says, now that I am older and wiser, I see things in ages. There is always going to be a rise and fall. I am seeing interesting fantasy books come out over the last few years, and it brought up this question: do you think that it's changed all that much? And Matt, we'll turn to you first. Do you think the fantasy genre has stagnated over the last 20 years?
I think he's partially right. I mean, there's definitely established tropes that are hard for people to get away from. But I think that, I think I would recommend sort of maybe mixing the genre up a little bit and maybe looking at it, if you want something different, looking at kind of modern fantasy type settings. I mean, you mentioned Neil Gaiman or Neil Gaiman or however he says his name. I think that's a good one. I mean, the Dresden Files is actually pretty well known. Mm-hmm. There's also recently, I mean, so even some older stuff. I mean, you have Zelazny, Amber, Chronicles of Amber. That's different. It's part fantasy and part mystery, and the different books are a little different, but it's definitely, it feels kind of different than the standard kind of sword and sorcery fantasy.
Or hey, if you want something that's outside of the realm of normal, how about go back and read the Dark Tower series by Stephen King?
Oh yeah, that's true. That is definitely
infused with all kinds of different pastiche of styles and makes a really evocative story. Apparently not a great movie, but
I think it's unforgettable.
Well, I mean, do you guys think it's stagnated though? Like, because I'm looking back at the fantasy books that I've read growing up, and Matt, you and I were talking a little bit before the show how you've turned a bit more sci-fi in recent years, and so have I.
I don't think it's really stagnation per se. I think it's kind of a volume problem. I think, and I think this was true even back, I mean, now we see it more because there's more media, but I think it's always been true. I mean, it's like people always say like the golden oldies, like, oh, old music was better, movies better. It's not that it was better. There was a lot of crap out there, and it's just the ones that were really good are the ones that people read or watch 20 years later. And I think with fantasy, it's the same thing. There's a lot of derivative work out there. I mean, that's just the way it is. And finding the ones that are, different is hard. I haven't read it yet, but I've heard really good things about the Broken Earth series. That's supposed to be fairly original and evocative. So my point is that there's always good stuff out there, and there's always derivative stuff out there. And, and it's just hard sometimes to track down. And it's true not just in fantasy. I think it's true in any genre. And I think that's the problem you're facing, because you walk into the bookstore, and, when we still went to bookstores, right? You walk into the bookstore and before everything was digital, and you go to the fantasy section. It's just like this like wall of books, and it's like, and they all have like really cool art on the covers, and it's like, oh wow, like where do you start? And I think it's basically the same problem.
And maybe it's a thing that 20 years from now, we'll look back at 2020 and be like, oh, these great books came out that right now we're looking at like so many that we can't pick the wheat from the chaff, So Steve, how about you? Do you think it's stagnated, or do you think it's just as strong as ever?
Well, I mean, I haven't been doing so much reading that I feel like I could say it's stagnated or not. I mean, certainly I'm still finding things that are expressing themselves in ways that I hadn't anticipated, telling types of stories that I never expected. I actually think as I'm spinning around in my chair to look at my shelf to see if I can find it, there was a book series by an author named, I think it's V.E. Schwab, and it's some different shade of magic, or let me look, which was actually really cool.
Wait, you don't keep it alphabetical and organized on your shelf then?
Yeah, so A Darker Shade of Magic. It's the first of 3 books in a series that's set. There's more than one Earth, and they're all different, but like there's sort of like these connective points, and there's like 4 different worlds, and magic has kind of got this different vibe on each of them. One's like including, I think, like Victorian age London, where magic is all but dead. And the main character is one of these rare types of magicians that can pass sort of between the worlds. And what's really cool about that is that it's got this great, sort of classic fantasy story, but the setting is just very imaginative. And also the characters are much more reflective of, I would say, like a more accepting and modern sense. So, one of the main characters is, I think, bisexual. He's like a prince, and it's not like it doesn't become like this big issue, but it's just a sort of a part of that character, and showing a society where these things aren't as important. One character has like, she's like missing an eye, so she's kind of dealing with that, and there's just all these interesting sort of things working there, and it's something completely different than anything I'd read before. And I thought the idea of like, real world London, like that's dumb. I want a fantasy novel. But I gave it a shot and blew me away. That was one of the last series that I kind of just raced through in terms of reading. Matt talked about the Broken Earth stuff, but at the same time, there's still going to be a lot of that classic stuff, because that's what people want to read. Like sometimes I don't want to, be challenged when I pick up a book. I just want like a comfortable story to slide into, so there's always going to be that place for the, the basic, go back to the example of Dragonlance Chronicles of like, adventurers and saving the day and fighting the great evil. Like there's that's like a basic
sometimes
part
you want
of
the
but it helps if the characters are interesting. That's the most important, for any
absolutely interesting character.
You have to care about the characters. If you don't care about them, then it's not going to go
exactly. But I mean, so there's always going to be an element of that basic stuff. And there's always going to be stuff pushing. I think if anything, the fact that you've seen in the last few years, I mean, despite how it ended, Game of Thrones becoming, it was a TV series called Game of Thrones rather than A Song of Ice and Fire, which is the series name. But I mean, that certainly, punched a lot of people's tickets in terms of paying attention to fantasy type stuff again. And even that, in terms of a fresh take on fantasy. I mean, spoiler alert, main character dies at the end of the first novel, or one of the main characters. And if you don't know that by now, I'm really sorry I ruined that for you. I mean, they cast Sean Bean. You should know better. But I mean, I think that's a great example of something that plays they played with a lot of the tropes, and the ending was very unsatisfying. I don't know how well that'll map to the books. Not they're ever going to get written.
Still waiting.
But if they did, but if they did, where that would go. It's so much so that, I mean, I've read now, I think maybe it's Amazon is not only putting together a Lord of the Rings series that's been gestating, but I think they're also putting together a Wheel of Time series, which
that's an undertaking.
Yeah, and I've seen casting for it in that, so it's happening.
It's gonna take them 10 years to film that.
Probably, but you think about
how many books are in that series again? I lost that series 13? After the third book, I think.
I think it's 13. Oh, you didn't get very far?
I didn't get that far. But it's not like the books are small. I got through it was 3 books, and it's like, wow. All right, I was just.
Yeah, there's one book that's it's like book 10 or book 11, I think, and literally the whole book was over the course of 2 or 3 days, and that's where I hit my wit's end. I was having a conversation with a roommate, and we were talking about how so much of the books that had happened, things would have been solved quickly and easily had characters just bother to communicate. You have magic to teleport and stuff. Have a family dinner once every 2 weeks, and you could solve a lot of the stuff that I've been having to churn through in terms of reading in these really dense, long books, where it just felt for a while like Robert Jordan, rest in peace, was just padding the books. And then, of course, Sanderson came along and sort of wrapped up the series.
Right. He died before he finished it, right? I mean, he was, it was was it 10 or 11 in or something where he died, something like that?
Yeah, it was pretty far in.
Yeah.
But
which is amazing that authors do that. That's not the first time that's happened. That's happened several times where an author dies and other authors come in and finish.
Well, I mean, Stieg Larsson was his wife wrote the name, because he Stieg Larsson, or the girl with the dragon tattoo, right?
Oh yeah.
He died young. Yeah, he had a heart attack or something.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite novels were the Gormenghast novels with Titus Groan and all that. And I know he died. Mervyn Peake died, had dementia and stuff. And he finished it, but it was so out of whack for the third book that other authors came in and kind of reorganized stuff in order to kind of finish off that trilogy. So it's really cool when authors do that. I know we got a little sidetracked here, but it's interesting stuff. But
it's an interesting evolution of the genre, though. It speaks to that. I mean, you go back to even all the way back to Tolkien. I mean, there's been new Tolkien books that have come out in the last decade, like Children of Huron or something. Maybe that's even longer than a decade now. I can't recall, but that's just based off of notes and scribbles here and there, sort of cobbled together into a story. So I mean, there's lots of different ways this type of stuff goes. It's just a matter of how do you find good content. I think that's more of the issue than anything, right? Is just how do you find that good content?
Yeah, I agree.
And also everyone has a different sense of what makes it fresh for them. So I mean, there's definitely stuff out there for what's our questioner?
Barra Bowman. Yes.
I mean, and I think Barra Bowman kind of even mentions there's this shift where it sort of rises and falls. So, I mean, it's not all the same all the time. It comes and it goes and ebbs and flows. That's probably always going to be that way, but it seems to be a pillar of literature that it's not. I mean, I don't think it's at any risk of disappearing anytime soon. No, things like 5th edition are any indication.
Fantasy is going strong. It's really stronger than it's ever been.
Probably. Well, hey, very interesting topic to bring up there, Barra Bowman. Really enjoyed talking about it, but that is going to do it for us this week. Remember, if you want to send in your questions or anything you find on the internet, you can send them to questions@PotomacRPG.com. Check out our store for merch at teespring.com/stores/PotomacRPG. If you'd like to support the Potomac RPG podcast, you can find us on coffee.com/PotomacRPG. And lastly, you can follow us at Potomac RPG on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for being on today, Matt and Steve. Thank you to the rest of the Potomac RPG crew, and of course, all of our wonderful listeners out there. So, for the Potomac RPG podcast, I'm Adam.
I'm Matt.
And I'm Steve.
Till next time, keep those dice rolling, keep those stories coming, and
never stop
reading.
Releases, yeah. Damn it.
2 days. No, I can't do it.